Hello all, this is Steve from Game & Friends. I'm ranking each game in the Silent Hill series, from worst to best, and I'm going into detail on the elements that work and those that don't. And today, I'm talking about Silent Hill Origins. Silent Hill Origins was the first game not released by the original Team Silent, so it's usually fairly maligned as being the gateway into the bad Silent Hill games. There's no doubt that Origins makes some stumbles, but it's worth discussing at least some of its good points before ripping it apart. Much like Homecoming, it looks incredible. At the time of its release, Origins was one of the very best looking titles on the PSP, looking arguably better than any game preceding it. This was the first entry on a new system, so pains were always going to be taken to make sure that it looks good. I feel as though serious attempts were made to impress on a graphical level around this point, rather than in terms of creativity. I sort of understand this. Silent Hill 2, 3 and 4 were all released on the PlayStation 2, and there isn't much of a difference in terms of the way it looks. Even though I'm not happy about the change in focus, it does make sense to me why Konami would want to emphasize better graphics at this point. If they released yet another game that didn't push the envelope in terms of graphical fidelity, they probably thought they would lose some of their audience who felt the series was getting stagnant. This shift in focus might have been detrimental for the series, but let's appreciate the silver lining that's there. In very simple terms, Origins looks really, really good, so I'm at least partially grateful for that. As an overall package, Origins is a real mixed bag, and most people will attack it and defend it in equal measure. It drew fans like me in quite sneakily on the merit of it being a prequel to the first game. I've been a fan of the series from the beginning, so this tactic immediately had the power of nostalgia behind it. Say what you want about the game, it had a really great sell in terms of marketing. Unfortunately, its strongest marketing tool, the nostalgia, is also one of the game's main weaknesses. The connection between this game and Silent Hill 1, which was the main draw for me, isn't given an awful lot of focus, and neither is it all that memorable. There aren't really any revelations that you weren't aware of before. It just sort of dangles some characters in front of you at odd moments, as if to say, hey, look, these people existed before the first game. That was a little bit of a kick in the crotch, I won't lie, and it marks the start of serious pandering to fans that went on later in the series, particularly in Homecoming. That said, the game functions relatively well in terms of pacing and gameplay. It's more or less unchanged from the earlier entries, with the protagonist Travis just travelling from one place to another, fighting off demons until he gets a clue telling him where to go next. It's a very simple formula, and it's certainly more obvious here than anywhere else that the game is pushing you to new areas just for the sake of variety. But having said that, it has a shaky sort of humility and simplicity that I think gives it a certain charm. There's no major set pieces, no game-changing mechanics, and no real gimmicks unless you include the fact that it's a portable title. It's just Travis, going through the town, carrying a satisfyingly gruesome secret, and trying not to get molested by monsters who look like inside-out zoo animals. That said, while I do like its humility, it's not particularly high on this list, and that's because it does stumble in a few areas. It should be stressed that none of the individual mistakes made are real deal breakers. It's just an abundance of little niggly bits that bring it down. For one thing, we have the breakable weapons. There's nothing mechanically wrong with this concept, it's just oddly out of place here. As you approach the last area, it can ruin the atmosphere of the game a little bit as you cycle through the 17 CRT TVs you have in your inventory, deciding which one would be best to attack your enemies with. If there had been a limit on how many items you could carry, this might have given the survival aspect of survival horror a nice little boost. Instead, it just makes the game too easy, and a little bit ridiculous at times. Another issue is the odd decision to replicate a mechanic from The Legend of Zelda of all things. Whereas previous games had you enter the rusty, blood-stained otherworld sporadically, and in a way that heightened the emotion at a pivotal part of the story, Origins allows you to switch between the two worlds on the fly, provided you can find a mirror to cross over into. While I personally found Origins impressively creepy, it's reassuring to know that you can escape the hellish otherworld at the touch of your own reflection. And, as we have established before in previous videos, reassuring is not a good thing. We want to be on edge almost at all times.
Safe now.
These 2 points also feed into the biggest issue with the game. It's just too easy. A lot of this might have to do with it being a portable title. What I mean by that is, the developers might have felt that the game could only be played for a few minutes at a time, and if there is a difficult section in the game, it might require a couple of repeated attempts in a row to get past it. If you typically turn the console off when you die and come back to it later, you might not have retained the knowledge from the mistakes you made, which means that you could theoretically be stuck in the same place for a really long time. It's a logical train of thought, but not one I would have expected to apply to survival horror. The game tells you in the opening screen that it is best played in the dark with headphones on, which is exactly what I did. I don't see how a bit more challenge could have possibly hurt. As it is, the game itself stumbles in a few niggling areas, but I think it deserves some credit for providing an original story that isn't all that bad. As a prequel, it leaves a lot to be desired, but at least Travis's personal story has a nice payoff. Again, it's a compact, humble story without complexity. We learn that his mother suffered from mental problems and tried to murder him when he was a child. Subsequently, she spent the rest of her life in an isolation ward in an asylum. Travis's father, meanwhile, is hinted to have resented Travis and possibly abused him before hanging himself in misery. It struck me as a particularly grim backstory, and to have him face truly horrific memories that he had repressed in the form of monstrous versions of his parents is a pretty horrifying concept, especially if we bring Freud into the mix. And while the mirror aspect didn't really work from a gameplay point of view, I can at least appreciate its symbolism and how it serves the story. Travis is required to have a good long look at himself and face his horrific past, which played out by dragging him into a personal hell. It's best to keep Silent Hill Origins in mind as a spin-off, portable title, rather than the more canon PS2 re-release. The origins of Origins are humble, and taken as such, I think it does a good job of presenting Silent Hill on the go. It's a good overall game, it's just not particularly original.